In this video, I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Arthur Bradley, and many of you are probably familiar with his YouTube channel, EMP Doctor. Now, I recently have referenced some of his videos in a Faraday trash can video that I did, and I found his website and his YouTube channel to be an amazing source for information that I was able to utilize when I put that video together. And by the way, if you want to find out any more information about his YouTube channel, the products that he sells for EMP specific products, and any books that he has along with some coupon codes to his books, I'll post a link to all of that in the description and comment section below. So to begin with, I want to welcome you, Dr. Bradley. I appreciate you taking the time to join me on this interview.
Sure. Thank you for
What,
having me on.
Thank you for coming. What I'd love to do is start it off with allowing you to talk a little about yourself, kind of what you do. I know you and I had a conversation the other day, and I learned a lot just from that short call. And yeah, kind of talk about your credentials and your, why you do what you do with this discussion around EMPs.
Sure. Yeah. So my background is I have about 30 years of experience as an electrical engineer. I work for NASA during the day. I have a PhD in electrical engineering, and I do quite a bit of work in electromagnetics. And so this is kind of my specialty area of expertise. I got involved in the EMP community probably about 10 years ago. I wrote a book, an EMP book on, how you protect your equipment, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I did it was there was a lot of misinformation, still a lot of misinformation out on the web, just sort of stays there forever, gets passed from person to person. And so I spent a lot of time sort of debunking things, testing things, seeing what works, what doesn't work. A lot of my videos are in the lab where I'm in the lab checking out things. So I'm trying to put like a realistic engineering view on EMP preparedness and help people, protect their equipment.
Awesome. So I know most people coming to this video already know the answer to this question, but what is an EMP? If you're coming to this video the first time, you've never heard of this concept, could you explain that kind of in layman's terms?
Sure. Yeah. Most of the time when people are talking about an EMP, it stands for electromagnetic pulse. And what they're talking about is a high altitude EMP, which means you take a rocket and you put a nuclear warhead in it and you shoot it really high in the atmosphere, maybe 300 miles up. So very, very high. You detonate it and it ends up causing a disturbance, an electromagnetic disturbance that's felt at the surface of the Earth, as well as to satellites and other things that are nearby. And it's a very complex disturbance that people divided into E1, E2, and E3, which are sort of different events that happen in different time frames. But the short of it is that electromagnetic disturbance is very, very powerful, and it can damage small scale electronics like your cell phone or your car, as well as it can couple energy into, like, let's say a power grid or something like that and cause that system to go down as well. So it's very destructive to equipment, electrical equipment. It doesn't hurt anybody. Nobody's going to get shocked or nobody's going to get, any kind of effects to them. No animals will be harmed or anything like that. It's all really more about damage to electronics. And the more sophisticated the electronics, the more modern it is, the more likely it is to be damaged.
Got it. Obviously, our community is very concerned, and anybody should be for that matter, with an EMP in the sense that we've become so used to in our culture and our society. Everything runs on electronics. All of our systems. And if there was an event that were to take down the grid, take down our electronics, obviously that would be catastrophic. So what we did is we put together a poll on our community tab recently. We put together some different options for people to choose from what they would love to hear from you. And again, a lot of the community posted individual questions, and we took those questions and we kind of sifted through them all, and we compiled what we found was pretty much the top 20, 25 questions. And what I would love to do in this video is just allow you to address those questions again from your area of expertise. And what I'll do is I decided to start off with this first question because a lot of us in the last week or weekend, we heard in the news, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there would be a CME event. And a lot of people were able to see the Northern Lights all the way. I had friends that were posting down in Georgia. They were posting pictures of that. And so what I'd love to do is just kind of hear your thoughts on CMEs again versus an EMP. And when you and I spoke the other day, one of the things you said that I thought was very interesting, the likelihood of a CME in our lifetime versus an EMP. And so if you wouldn't mind talking a little about that, just kind of leading off with a CME.
Sure. Yeah. So CME stands for coronal mass ejection. Basically, the sun, it's a big ball of hot gas out there, occasionally throws off blobs of plasma, which is charged particles, that kind of like a cloud of charged particles. And those come over toward the Earth, and every once in a while they line up just right and they wash over the Earth. And when they do that, they disturb our geomagnetic fields, if you will, our magnetic field lines around the Earth. And that can couple energy into very long conductors. So you can couple energy into, let's say, the power grid and perhaps cause damage to it. You can do other things from it as well. You can affect satellites and you can cause hazards to people at very high altitudes, like astronauts, let's say. But the biggest threat from a CME is really that it might take down the power grid. And
Hmm.
we have evidence that it can do it. Back in 1989, there was a pretty big CME that hit the Earth and it took out some of the northern US and Canada for, I don't know, 12 hours or something like that. But there are much more powerful CMEs possible. We know that historically back in 1859, there was a giant CME that if we got one
Hmm.
today like that, we'd be in real trouble. But so that's what a CME is. It's a big charged gas that comes out of the sun. It often is accompanied by a solar flare, which you hear the two, and that solar
Hmm.
flare is really just a flash of light, like X-rays being released, and they often go together. The solar flare gets here as fast as we can detect it because it travels at the speed of light. So by the time we detect it, we can't really relay ahead it's coming. It just happens to us. Whereas
Hmm.
a CME might take up to a couple of days to get to us, this big gas that's coming through space. So we usually know they're coming. There's not a lot we can do about them. And the one that you're talking about right now, which we just had last couple of days, people started seeing auroras way down in the southern hemispheres. And the reason was it was a pretty big CME and it disturbed the field lines enough that these charged particles can sort of cause emissions of energy, which cause this light. It's beautiful. It's fascinating. Fortunately, it wasn't so bad that, we took out power grids or anything. It was
Right.
about 1/5 the level, about 20% of the level of the Carrington event, something along that. This most
Oh,
recent
wow.
one was, just to keep it in perspective.
Right.
Now, it can damage the power grid. We know that. And the EMP is a little different in that it's caused by this nuclear explosion, not the sun, right? But
Hmm.
it also has a similar effect. It can cause these complex disturbances at the surface, and they can also take out the power grid by a similar mechanism of a CME. So many times people sort of compare the two and say, well, they're both kind of the same thing. Well, they're very, very different, but they can have the same effect on the power grid. The difference of an EMP is it also has the ability to damage small freestanding electronics like your laptop that's just sitting on your table or your cell phone or your car or an airplane. A CME, the things from the sun, don't really have the ability to do that. They can really only affect very, very long conductor systems like the power grid. So that's the
Okay.
distinction between the two.
Okay. And one of the things that you did mention when we spoke is the likelihood of I don't know what you would call it, a severe CME event in our lifetime. What's your thoughts on that? I mean, again, I can't hold
Yeah.
you to any kind of predictions, but I mean, if you were to put it, if you're a betting man, how would you view that?
Yeah, a betting man. So statistically, the number I've always heard is about every 150 years you get a really big CME that hits
Hmm.
the Earth. They happen all the time, but usually they go off in the wrong direction and they don't hit the Earth, right? We're this tiny little thing. And so
Yeah.
occasionally, though, they do come our way, and really big ones hit us about every 150 years on average. Well, if you go back to the Carrington event and say that was our last big one, we're a little
We're
bit past
overdue.
due. Yeah, so is there a really big one going to hit us in the next 20 years? I think there's a reasonable chance, maybe 20% or something like that, a reasonable thing that you'd want to think about. And
Sure.
again, a CME is a certainty, right? We get CMEs all the time. There's no like, oh, it will just never happen. It will absolutely happen. The only
Okay.
question is when and what will the effect be? That's the only question.
Okay. So in conclusion on that one, it's highly probable, at least 20%. That's a pretty significant number. And maybe that's something you can answer in a question, but is that the level of protection that you can, or the actions that you can take to protect yourself, are they similar to an EMP? Or are people just going to have to make sure their house is hardened off against, incoming power sources?
Yeah, they are very similar preparations as we'll talk about. An EMP is sort of a superset problem where if you prepare for an EMP, you are inherently
Okay.
prepared also for a CME. So if we focus
Okay.
our talk on EMP, everybody can kind of say, well, I've got CME covered as well.
Got it. Okay. Well, that's kind of leads into the next question. Several people asked about protecting different devices that you may be using, for example, a CB or maybe a solar panel or something like that that is active that you wouldn't necessarily put away in a Faraday bag or Faraday trash can or something like that, but something that you might use on a regular basis. And again,
Sure.
the specific question was in relation to communication devices like a CB. So is there any
Yeah.
way to protect those against an
Well,
EMP event?
Yeah, so every device is different in terms of their protections and the preparations you can make, but communication devices are difficult because what's their role? Where their role is to have a little antenna of some sort or another, CB or
Hmm.
cell phone, they all have antennas, and that antenna is going to look for the tiniest wisps of electromagnetic disturbances and bring it in and translate it into some useful information for you, right? So
Yeah.
it's got this front end amplifier, it's hypersensitive to electromagnetic energy, and all of a sudden you've got the loudest
Mm.
possible source you can imagine screaming into this
Right.
system. So systems like that, like radio systems and cell phones that are intentionally designed to pick up that energy, are very likely to be damaged. And there's not a whole heck of a lot you can do except for make sure the antennas are not connected, or the units themselves are
Mm.
shielded when they're not in use. But if you have a CB radio or a ham radio and an EMP occurs and it's fully active at the time, I think there's a very high probability it would be damaged. There's not a lot you're going to do to prevent that.
Got it. So from a comms perspective, that's one of the devices. It's best to probably have a backup option, shielded away and protected.
Right. Yeah. And
Oh,
something like maybe one of these shielded bags or something like that would be great. Yeah.
okay. So the next question is, how soon after an EMP event can you take the items out of the Faraday cage or the Faraday bag to actually begin to use them?
Sure. Yeah. So the EMP has three sort of events that happen in time. The first one takes about 20 nanoseconds to occur. It's a really big E1 pulse that hits. You're never going to even know that happened, right? So quick, 20
Mhm.
nanoseconds. The other one is in the microsecond range. So again, it's over before you can blink your eye. And then the third phase, I like to compare it to like a swelling of water when tide water comes in. It's going to be a slow building energy on very long conductors, like your power lines, for example. And that one might take several minutes, maybe even an hour to fully get through. So when is it safe to take things out of an EMP bag? Well, as soon as you know the EMP has occurred, you can take things out because E1 and E2 are already done. And
Mm.
those are the things that that will harm those small electronics. It won't really be over though until this third phase comes up. But that energy is really only coupling into things that are plugged in to these very long conductors. So
Okay.
I always tell people the one thing you could do if you detect an EMP, like you're just really sure an EMP just happened, go out to your breaker box and throw the main breaker, right? Immediately do that. Because what that does is it prevents the E3 energy, that swelling energy, from coming in from the power lines and corrupting all of the stuff in your home. That'd be a good
Okay.
preparation to do.
No, that's a great answer and totally makes sense. Thank you. The next question is in relation to I get these emails all the time. Will this product protect me? I've seen this one marketed. So there's a lot of these particular, EMP protection options on the market. Instead of trying to address each one individually, what do you say is important to look for if you are shopping one?
Yeah, so there are a number of companies, including the one I work for, that sell EMP products. And I don't know, I haven't tested all of them. I've tested a number of them. The short answer is it's difficult for a consumer to sort through all the marketing, right? There's a lot of marketing out there on various products, and there's mill standards thrown around, and there's pretty pictures, and there's guarantees of a certain millions of dollars of damage protection, lots of things that make it seem like this must be a really great product. But the reality is you really want to get down to the data. If you can get to the data, if a company posts the data that they tested, like we tested this, here's our data, and you can go in and look at that data and it kind of makes sense to you, like, hey, these bags, they shield at 99.7%. That's data. I can take that data and run some numbers and believe what I'm doing. If
Yeah.
there's a lot of hype and marketing around we solve world peace and global hunger and everything else, it's probably not as good as what it's sounding like, right? And I don't put too much into those kind of things. So look for the data. I always like companies that tell you what their product won't do, what the limitations of the product
Hmm.
is. Does this guarantee that I'm going to survive an EMP? If the answer is yes, you probably don't want that product. Okay. Because an EMP is a very unpredictable thing with many, many variables that can affect you. For example, you have a vehicle and somebody says, oh, if I put this and this on my car, will my vehicle survive? If the answer is an unequivocal yes, it will, I wouldn't buy that product. And the
Okay.
reason is that an EMP could have different field levels. It could come in at different angles. Your car may be in a different state than, a physical state than another vehicle. Could be oriented a certain way. It could have susceptibilities that you don't know about. There's many, many factors that would
Got
answer,
it.
will it survive or not? And the short answer is, I don't think anybody can guarantee that with,
Okay.
truth, not embellishing a little bit. So instead, I like to say, these protections, whatever protections you employ, are used to buy down your risk, right? That's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to buy down the risk. Maybe there was an 80% chance you were going to have some damage before you put these protections on. Maybe now it's 30% or 20%, or the
Okay.
damage is much less significant, right? And that's the angle I come at it, is that EMP protective products are not guarantees. They're really about buying down risk.
Okay. No, that's a fair answer. I mean, so obviously look for the any type of test results that can give any conclusive, probabilities, like you pointed out, something that's not hyped and something that's honest. That hey, it's not going to be 100%. There are going to be these issues that will come up. Yeah, I think those are all great answers because we all know the marketing that we all see that
Sure.
guarantees everything, right? And
Yeah.
again, I'm like you. I'm kind of weary of that. So, but no, I appreciate that's a good clarification. The next question comes down to what would be destroyed, and really they were trying to ask myth versus facts. I know there's a lot of EMP. I've read my fair share of EMP related fiction for the preparedness community. I've bought some books over the years, and some of them were good. But I mean, they always, give the worst case scenario. Everything that has any electrical component, anything is destroyed. So I know that's kind of a hard question to answer because, again, like you talked about, there's a lot of variables. So if you were to, how should I put this? Maybe let's use a hypothetical scenario of there's an EMP event, a nuclear bomb has been detonated. I live in Southern California. Let's hypo- hypothetically say in Los Angeles. That's horrible to think about, but I
Yeah.
mean, it's a
Yeah.
prime target, right? It's a high population density. And so if people living in that area survive the initial blast and they're outside of that radius, and what could they expect to probably will work versus what will not?
Yeah. Okay. So it could be different thing. An EMP may be a part of an attack, right? Let's say there was a true nuclear attack on the U.S. and you had some people killed and damaged and property damaged. That could be part of the attack. And then an EMP would be an overhead strike, which nobody was damaged by, but caused all kinds of property damage and destruction of communications and electronics. What would be damaged? Well, many things would be damaged. I think there'd be tremendous loss of electrical appliances and electrical apparatus of all different sorts. The one thing that most books, I think, maybe over exaggerate is the loss of vehicles and airplanes and things like that. Vehicles and airplanes and boats are pretty hardened. They're actually pretty hard to damage from electromagnetic energy. And so my guess is there'd be very few planes. It wouldn't be like all the planes would fall out of the sky or something like that. I think there'd be very few of that type of thing that occurred. I'm not saying none, because it's certainly
Mhm.
possible, but very few. In terms of vehicles, I don't think it's like every modern car is going to stop working. But I do think enough of them would be. Let's say even if it was 10 or 20% of all vehicles were damaged, you can imagine 20% of every car on the road all of a sudden being inoperable, right? The roadways would just be immediately impassable, right?
Right.
And not easily cleared either, because all of the other subsystems and infrastructures are going to start collapsing at the same time. Emergency services and all of them, right? Food distribution, government, finances, I go on down the list. Everything relies on electrical power, and that would be the thing that would get hit. That would be the worst. So certainly we'd have lots and lots of damage to our own individual electronics, to our government electronics, to our banking system electronics, to gas stations you couldn't check out, to teller machines. Yeah, just across the board, a lot of electronics could be damaged. What percentage, who knows? But I think a true like high power EMP over a place like Los Angeles would be world changing for that area, at least for a
Sure.
time. It would
Yeah.
be, Armageddon like, where there would be so many ramifications that came out of it that, people would panic and there would be lots of chaos that would ensue. If it was localized to one area, we would recover, right? Even if the
Okay.
grid went down, there'd be emergency things brought in. People step up, people manage. If it hit over, let's say several, there was one over the eastern seaboard and one over Los Angeles, one over central US, and you managed to take down the grid as a whole, all five infrastructures, then it would take a much longer period of time to recover, maybe months, maybe longer. And that would be something like we haven't seen before, at least not in my lifetime.
You just said something that was interesting. Five structures. What do you mean by that?
Well, the grid in general is made up of hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of companies operating all these different
Mhm.
utility areas. And so it's a very, very, our grid is this super complicated commercialized thing, right? But it has five main interconnects, that's what they're usually called. And if
Okay.
you look them up, you can find them on a map, like the Texas Interconnect. And so they have these five interconnects. And within each one, there are all these organizations that operate and man and keep it running and all that. If you could take down these major interconnects, you essentially would bring down the grid, especially if you did it in a way that caused permanent damage to these large transformers, which are used to convert voltages on the grid. There's no way to quickly recover. You can't just power it down and bring it back up if you've caused that damage. And that
Mhm.
is the big worry that the EMP Commission and others came away with was, hey, you can cause all kind of permanent damage that would take a long, long time to repair. And they made pretty grave predictions, a year. It could take a year to bring everything back up and you would have huge loss of life. I tend to be a little more optimistic than that, but it's still very, very serious if you could manage to bring down those large systems like that.
Well, no, I appreciate you clarifying that. It's um, obviously, if you know that information, it's public.
Yeah,
And
it's
so,
everywhere. Everyone
it's,
knows. Yeah.
I'm sure everybody knows that as well, especially our enemies. So, no, I appreciate you clarifying that. The next question is in relation to solar panels. I get asked this all the time because I do so many solar videos. Again, where I live in Southern California, we have an abundance of sun. So solar is an obvious power source where I live. And the question usually comes up is if you have a solar panel disconnected from from your setup and maybe off in the garage stored as an individual unit, again, not tied into, or getting sun or anything like that, not being actively used, would it survive an EMP event?
Yeah, so the likelihood is that yes, a solar panel that's completely disconnected would survive an EMP without any trouble. So if you have it in a box and it's just stored away in the garage, it's probably going to be fine. If
Okay.
as soon as you connect it to the wires, though, and they go over to the inverter, right, now you're part of a system, whether it's getting sunlight or not, now it's potential that it could be damaged, as well as the inverter could be damaged. And there are things you can do to protect that. You can put ferrites at each end of those long wires, the PV wires, one up by the panels and one down by the inverter. That certainly helps to keep energy from flowing into those systems. But so the short answer is if it's fully disconnected, yeah, the solar panels would be okay. If it's connected, you need to take some protections and put some protections in place for the system.
And are there any products you sell that can protect solar panels that are connected in the system?
There are, yeah. So we sell some large ferrites. I've got one here. Ferrites are just these big ferrous clamp-on things you clamp around the cables. And the idea is they suppress current transients that get introduced on cables. And the cables are where all the energy is going to get into primarily. And so if you have
Right.
long cables, maybe from your panels on the roof down into your garage where the inverter is or whatever, that's a pretty long cable. Energy can couple into it, flow both directions and cause damage. So you pinch both of the wires essentially at each end. You put a ferrite around the cables at each end so that the energy that flows gets, essentially it takes that current energy, that transient energy, and turns it into a magnetic field disturbance, which gets suppressed by this ferrite. And so it
Huh.
acts like a damper, kind of like a electromagnetic damper, if you will, at each end of the cable. And that's
Okay.
quite effective. At the inverter, you can also put, let's say, surge protection devices. And there's upstream, you can start putting ferrites and surge protection devices to protect your home as well. So there's a number of things you can do to protect the home, but just for the solar panels themselves, that's what I recommend is use those large ferrites at each end of the PV wires.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. That makes sense. Um, so there were several questions. I don't know if this one was a kind of a trolling question about neural implants, wearing a tinfoil hat to protect their brain. Let's just probably lump that one into think someone's just having fun. But this next question, it kind of a similar question of how will an EMP affect medical equipment like hearing aids or pacemakers, and can those things be protected?
Yeah, I get asked that question quite a bit. The good news is that, like pacemakers in particular, they are electromagnetically hardened. They expect people to get disturbances. They don't want a nearby lightning strike to shut your
Mhm.
pacemaker off and you die, right? So they have tested those. There is actual test data doctors have sent me and said, "Hey, would you look at this test data?" They can take pretty good fields before they will be damaged. They may get upset and have to be restarted, but they don't typically get damaged. With all that said, no one that I know has ever tested a pacemaker or a hearing aid or any of those kind of things with an actual EMP wave. So I don't know for sure if they would be damaged. They're small, which is good, but they're also
Okay.
pretty sensitive, which is not good. And so it's actually something on my to-do list. I actually have a tabletop EMP generator now, and I'm going to try and get a couple models of pacemakers and maybe a couple of hearing aids and test them out under real fields and see what happens, see if they get damaged or not, because I think it's really important to know that. Now, as
So
far
you
as
actually have
protecting,
oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
as far as protecting, I don't know that there's a lot you're going to be able to do. Pacemakers are implanted typically, hearing aids are
Sure.
typically in your. It might be that you could, if you were really, really worried about it, you could wear, let's say, a conductive shirt for example. They make, silver-based shirts, silver-threaded shirts, which would reduce the fields that the pacemaker would see. And if my life depended on it, I would do it. But I think at this point, with not enough data, I don't know that something like that's really, practical for somebody to worry about.
Okay. No, it's a fair assessment. So this next question is kind of in relation to, I think, the second question about specifically comm devices, your ham radio, your Baofeng radio, these things that a lot of people have in our community. And I know you mentioned obviously those devices would be susceptible because they have an antenna that's designed to pull in that signal. But if the battery were disconnected when not in use, would that give it any advantage to survive?
Not much. Yeah. Same way with cars. You can disconnect the battery. It really doesn't matter because the energy that the battery is powering the system with is pretty low level, and you're going to introduce huge amounts on top of that. So whether you're up 12 volts when you start or whether you're not, probably doesn't make any difference. It's actually the same for the power grid, by the way. It really doesn't matter if we throw the switch and bring the grid down, if you want to call it that. We can still be damaged by a CME or an EMP, even with the grid officially taken offline. So it's because the system is still there. There's still energy can get coupled into it and cause all kinds of damage. And so the short answer is removing the battery doesn't do a whole lot to protect from an EMP. If you have a radio system and you want to protect it, you need to get the antenna disconnected, or you need to put it into some kind of a shielded enclosure. That's the best way for comms.
Now, kind of extending out that question, because again, I get asked this a lot, not only just comm devices, but any type of device with a battery. Is there really any advantage if, I'm trying to think of something around here that has a battery connected to it. I don't know, just a typical device that you may say, well, this is important to me. Does taking out the batteries serve any purpose? Because again, you just mentioned even disconnecting the car from, the car battery. I mean, is there
Not
any
really.
advantage to taking batteries
No,
out?
I don't think so. I don't think there's much benefit from removing batteries from an EMP for an EMP protection. Batteries by themselves, by the way, are not damaged by an EMP. Typical alkaline batteries, chemical batteries are not affected by EMP. So you don't have to store those in a Faraday cage or anything like that. The
Okay.
exception to that is smart batteries that have like battery charge monitoring and things inside of them. Those batteries could be damaged because they have little circuits in there that are monitoring the state of the battery. But
Got
just
it.
normal, go to Walmart and buy a pack of batteries. Those are not going to be damaged by an EMP. And I don't know that, I mean, there are other reasons to remove batteries from products not being used, right? Because you can end up with leakage and other problems. But I don't know that it helps you in terms of EMP protection very much to remove it.
Okay.
So I just, I don't know that I'd go to that trouble. I would, if it's a battery operated device and I'm really worried about it, I would store it away in some kind of Faraday bag or Faraday cage.
Okay. Yeah. Again, I get when I did the Faraday trash can video, that was several comments were along those lines of take the battery out of the device, whatever it is you're storing. And I had no ability to,
Yeah,
say, well, that's correct or not, because I just, but again, thank you for clarifying that. That makes a lot of sense. Now, this question is a little more specific when it comes to EMPs, and the person was asking, I don't know if you can really speak to this or not, but water pumps for a water well. I guess this is getting more into the practical applications of specific devices, but something big that's sitting out like that, I mean, what chances does it have, or is there any level of protection that can be offered?
sure. Yeah. I actually worked for a summer putting in submersible water pumps. So I know, I know a little bit about it. So yeah, so there's a couple different kinds. There are some that are up above the surface, and there's some that are submersible that go down into the well. The ones that are submersible, which seems like the more common type, at least that I've seen, what you'd want to do is you'd want to use a ferrite on the power wires just before they go down into the well. All right, so you could put a ferrite right there, which would try and keep the energy that comes onto those wires from going down into the well and damaging the pump, right? Once the pump is down in the ground enough, the earth itself acts as a pretty good shield. It actually reflects off RF energy and absorbs RF energy. So the only way to get to the pump, the submersible pump, is by those wires that go down to it. And so if you can put a ferrite around those power wires as close to it before it goes down as possible, that does a good job of preventing that energy from going down into it. And that's probably the best thing. Now, if you have a controller that's above ground, like in a pump house or something, you can also put ferrites around the power wires that go to it, and you could try and put a shielded enclosure around that controller if you want to do that as well to try and keep some of the radiated energy off of it.
Okay. No, it's yeah, again, this whole discussion with the ferrites and everything, is that the item that you were holding up earlier with relation to
Yeah.
solar panels, or?
Yeah, so
Okay.
these are ferrites here, and there's all different sizes, just based on what size wires you're putting them around. The one thing I
Okay.
tell people is Ferrites, in general, they always go around the positive and negative wires together. Okay, people get a little confused about that. So if you have a red wire and a black wire, the positive, negative, the ferrite goes around both of them. Okay, it doesn't go
Oh,
around
okay.
just one, because if you get too much current in the wire, it saturates the ferrite. It's kind of like a sponge that gets too much energy and it can't really work properly. But if you can put both wires in it, the current goes both directions, and so it keeps it from saturating. All right.
Okay.
Now, the one exception to that is on our home. The wires are so thick, right? They're as thick as my thumb coming in. You can't really get a ferrite around, both hot lines and the neutral lines. It's just not physically possible to do it. And so you have to use special ferrites around each individual wire, one around line one, line two, and neutral. And those are called high saturation ferrites. We have those at disasterprepare.com. I think they're the only ones in the world made just for that reason. And you clip one ferrite around each individual wire, and they don't saturate, they saturate at much higher current levels than a typical ferrite. So that's why they're used that for that reason.
Okay. Have you installed those on your home?
I do. I have those on my
Yeah.
home, and I have a surge protector on my home as well.
Nice. Okay. Um, so the next question, and this is probably the biggest question I get asked every time I do anything in relation to, Faraday cans, trash can, is, well, what's the point of protecting electronics like your cell phones, your computers, if there is no internet or cell service after an EMP, even protecting your ham radio or something like that. That's usually the biggest objection to
Sure.
building out any type of protection because if the grid goes down, we're not communicating or how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think it's the same question we face with almost all of our large preparations, which is why bother? The world's going to be in a hell in a handbasket. Why bother? In this case, it's a very specific question, which is, hey, if everything is down, why do I care if I have functioning electronics or not, right?
Yeah.
And the short answer I always tell people is, I don't know about you, but the one thing I want is I want to have some options, all right? And that's why I
Hmm.
prepare. I want to have enough options that I have things I can do. So for example, let's say the grid does go down, but I've managed to save all my electronics. Well, there are backup power sources I can use. I have a generator on my house. There are solar power generation systems people have. Now that gives me some options. If everything's still functional, I can bring up my house for an hour and keep my freezer at least where the food's not lost. I can maybe use my ham radio and call for emergency help. I can do, I can get information. There's a lot of things I can do if I still have a functioning household that we all take for granted, because we just are so spoiled with electricity always being there. Where if you want to know what life's
Yeah.
like, go throw the breaker for a few hours and you'll figure out all the things you're taking advantage. But I like to have those options, and I think that even if you could argue that most of our systems are going to be down for a good long while, I would argue that having all of these possible things around me that I might be able to bring up for short periods of time would make my life much, much easier and maybe even help my chance at survival.
Okay. No, that's an excellent answer because again, there's kind of a cynical view of this of why even try. And like you said, it gives you options. And that's kind of the point of preparedness. There are no 100% guarantees, but in my mind, I just view preparedness from the perspective of increasing your odds. So yeah, 100% makes sense. The next question, and I didn't verify this before, I saw the question looking over this, but as far as a Carrington event in the 1800s, this question or basically asked, will the wires in the walls burst into flames like the power lines did in the 1800s? Are you familiar with that? Or was there any reports of that with the Carrington event? And if so, is that an issue if you don't have protection on your home?
Yeah, so Carrington Event was a really big CME, solar flare followed by a big CME back in 1859. Of course, back in those days, we didn't have many electronic things, right? We had the telegraph system. And the telegraph system are these big, long conductors that ran across the country, and energy coupled into them from the CME and flowed along. And what was interesting is the telegraph operators could shut off their systems and they could still communicate with the telegraph system because it was enough energy in the lines, it would just use that energy to communicate.
Wow.
But it did cause some fires, some things overheated, some people got shocked. I do not think our homes would burst into flames or anything like that. I don't think our wires would, there's no path by which the current is going to flow. The heat comes from current flowing through the wires. You got to have quite a lot of current to overheat wires. And our breakers are supposed to open before the wires downstream would ignite. Okay, so our
Right.
main breaker on our house and the sub breakers would start to pop. So I don't think the home's going to catch on fire. Now, would upstream transformers and other things catch on fire? Maybe, maybe. Because there's going to be a lot of energy, a lot more energy at those levels with very large conductors, and you certainly could end up with some things getting too hot and overheating, maybe catching fire. But I think from an individual standpoint, no, I don't think there would be fires, house fires resulting from it. That's my guess.
Okay. The next question, and this has been a popular conversation I've seen within the preparedness community and a lot of the fiction that I've read is, talking about different types of cars, older cars before they installed electronics, like pretty much every new car. Is there specific things to look for in if you're purchasing an older car, if you're wanting to make sure it's going to be protected by an EMP or not be susceptible to an EMP? For example, is just you want everything to be non-electronic, carburetors, these type of things versus the electronic fuel injection and so on. Is there something, I don't know how much you've really considered that, but
Yeah,
what would
yeah,
you
it
say
comes
to
up.
that question?
Yeah, it's a good question. A lot of people think, hey, if I can just get a 1981, Chevy pickup truck, that won't be affected versus my, 2023 brand new Silverado. And they're probably right in the sense that older vehicles are much less susceptible to an EMP because they don't have all of the small scale electronics that we have now, all of these microprocessors and controllers
Yeah.
doing displays and all that. My car's got this big 17-inch LCD display thing in it or something, and I'm sure it's going to be damaged. So yes, there is certainly a chance that older vehicles would be less susceptible. I think it's almost a certainty. The problem with older vehicles, of course, is they're not very dependable, right? You might end up broken down for lots of other reasons than an EMP. But as a backup vehicle, sure, it makes a lot of sense to have maybe an older vehicle if you're really worried about EMP. You can also keep even modern vehicles covered. You can buy a conductive cover, a conductive
Hmm.
cloth. We sell some of those. They're very expensive, so you have to be sure you want one. But you make a big conductive tarp and you lay it over your car. It does a great job of protecting from an EMP. It's just expensive.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think it's fair to assume older vehicles, and there's no specific like, oh, 1983 and younger is, going to be okay. It's sort of a progressive sliding scale. The more modern you get, the more likely it
Sure.
would be to be damaged, and probably the more important it is that you put some protections in place on the vehicle.
Okay. So the next question comes down to what will happen to nuclear power plants if there's an EMP today. I don't know why a nuclear power plant specifically, but is there anything that you see that is different than a traditional, gas turbine or, a coal burning facility with an
Sure.
EMP or, EMPs?
Yeah, no, it's a question I had about 3 years ago. I wrote an article. If somebody searches the web, they'll find my article out there. It's about 3 or 4 pages, and I had that same question. What happens during a long duration blackout to nuclear power facilities? There's about 100 different nuclear power plants. What's going to happen to those things? Because they need the electrical grid to keep cool. And if they don't keep cool, you end up with things like Fukushima or 3 Mile
Hmm.
Island, right? And so you get a really big worrisome situation. And that's one reason why people don't like nuclear power is it relies on the electrical grid to stay operational and stay safe. Well, I thought I'm going to get answers to this. So I called one of the nuclear power plants and I got a meeting with them and we had long conversations. I want to know what's the story here? A long blackout. Are we all going to go or, is the world over? I said, no, here's the deal. All right. And the guy was very honest about it. And I put this in the paper I wrote. It basically said it's just like other preparedness, it's multi-layered protections, right? So yes, we can lose electrical power from the grid, and we have an emergency failsafe. Nobody has to throw a button that says, "Oh crap, we just lost electrical power." It's immediately dead man where the system cuts off. He said, but unfortunately, you have to keep it functional for several days, or it will melt down. And if it meltdowns, you're in trouble, right? And so
Hmm.
this is in the reactor itself. So you got to keep the reactor like fully functional for a few days, but they have these giant building sized generators that they can use. Well, I'm like, okay, that sounds great, but what if the generators are damaged, right? Oh, well, that's unlikely, but if they are damaged, I'm acting like the guy. He says, we can roll in, we have portable generators on standby, ready to go. We can roll them in and use these portable generators to power it for that period of time until we can open the reactor and get the rods out and store them in the pool. And I said, okay, what happens if those portable generators are damaged? He said, well, we can sort of self-run it. The actual heat from the reactor can run a turbine, which might keep it cool enough.
Hmm.
I'm like, okay, that's a few levels of protection. I said, what if that fails? He said, then we flood it. And so the
Hmm.
bottom line was they build them near water. And if they have to, they flood them. They blow the dam or whatever it is, and they flood the region. So could it all go wrong? Yes, it has all gone wrong a couple of times in our history, at least, right? At least a few, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima. It can go wrong, but there are a lot of layered protections that are trying to ensure that it doesn't go wrong.
Okay.
So that's the short answer. There's lots of interesting detail about nuclear power plants and their giant swimming pools with stored rods in it. That all
Yeah.
this stuff that's very fascinating. But the short answer is I left thinking we're probably okay. I think there's enough attention on nuclear power plants. People will not let them melt down if there's any way to prevent it.
Sure. Okay, no, that makes sense. Now, this next one is not necessarily tied to electronics, but it's an interesting question is what effect would an EMP have on things like seeds or seed fertility? And I think I'm not sure if the person that wrote the question is maybe comparing it to a microwave or some type of, something, a signal that could do, damage to
Sure.
the whatever, the biological aspect of the seed. So, yeah, is there any impact that EMPs have on things like seeds?
I would say almost certainly no. All right. Now I don't have the data, and again, I was all about data, right? So this is an educated guess. But the energy from an EMP, the E1 and E2 energy, is so brief in time. Yes, it's very powerful, but it's so brief in time, it doesn't really go down and affect cellular level things, all right, to my understanding. And the E3 only affects things that are connected to really long conductors. So we can kind of throw that one out. So E1 and E2 are so short in time, they really don't
Hmm.
have enough energy versus time to affect, molecular level biological things like that. So I don't think seeds or anybody's fertility or anything like that would be affected by EMP.
Okay. So yeah, obviously that question extends, and as you pointed out, to our own biological, composition of our bodies, that it's not like a radioactive, being exposed to radioactive material in EMP. This is a much more short-lived event that really has no effect on us biologically.
Yeah, and the difference between the radiation is it's an ionizing. If you get exposed to radiation, that means the energy is so energetic and at such a frequency, it actually starts stripping electrons off of the atoms. It's ionizing things, and that can cause damage, ionization damage to your tissues and to your cells. And that can cause all kind of problems, and certainly that can affect seeds, right? We know that. But an EMP is not an ionizing event. It ionizes atmospheric molecules, but it doesn't have the energy to ionize electrons or atoms in our body by stripping off electrons. So it's not an ionizing effect and can't cause that kind of radiation damage.
Okay. So the next question is, will my electronic safe, like a gun safe, would it be affected by an EMP?
Mine won't. I bought one of those safes with the old timey dial locks, and all that. For that reason in particular. So my answer probably is the answer is I think yeah, there's a possibility that these digital gun safes, which are great, they're very slick to get in and out of. I think there's a very real possibility they could be damaged. They're easy enough to prevent that. You can put something conductive over the face of the lock, right? People, you can even use aluminum foil if they want. You can use conductive cloth or whatever and drape it over, then magnetize it or tape it over the lock to help prevent some damage. But I do know one of the lock companies. I can't say who they were because I signed an NDA, but they're big time expensive lock company for gun safes. They were worried enough about it that they did EMP testing on their locks. And if you search gun safe locks EMP, you'll probably find them out there. And I think they've published that data, and I reviewed that for them. So they wanted to know, will my gun safes be even openable or not? And they wanted to be able to
Yeah.
market that. And theirs were in fact protected. They had done enough work with it that their locks survived. They did 10 EMPs on a lock and the locks, survived. So
Wow.
it's a good question. I think if I had a gun safe with a digital combination, I would definitely put something over the face of it to try and protect it.
And you do a video on your channel about that, don't you?
I think I do. Yeah, I think I have one
Oh,
where I
yeah.
do a low cost solution of just sort of putting something over the thing.
Okay. We'll put a link to that below. Now, I know you answered this question from a time perspective. If all five of the main, grid points were all hit at the same time in the United States, but let's look at maybe one localized event. I know we talked about LA and gave that as an example earlier, but the question is, how long would it take for the power grid to come back online after an EMP event? Obviously depending on the city and these different things, but if there was one localized, you know, EMP versus the entire grid, what do you think is a realistic timeline for that city to probably come back online? And again, I know there's a lot of
Yeah,
variables, but kind of
sure.
best guess.
Yeah, so an EMP, it depends on how high the detonation occurs at, but it's a very broad area, right? If you detonate one over the central US, you can almost get coast to coast, right? So it's really broad areas if you get up high enough. But let's say somebody just targeted the eastern seaboard and they detonated one such that it was at an altitude where it just took out the eastern seaboard. They could cause $1 trillion worth of damage. That was the estimate I saw just from a detonation like that. So it's big
Jeez.
impact, right?
Sure.
Would the people there all die though? No, they wouldn't, because the rest of the country would come to their aid, as would the rest of the world. So the impact of it would not be the same as if we took out all of the grid everywhere in the US, but it would still be a tremendous impact, not only to those people, but to our entire country, just because of the economic hit, if nothing else.
Hmm.
Oh, in terms
Okay.
of time, I don't know how long it would take, but an event like that, my guess is it might be handfuls of weeks before they could get in replacement parts and get things operational. That's just a guess.
And if they have the parts that they need available.
Yeah.
Yeah, from my understanding, so much of our grid is dependent upon equipment that's often back ordered, not in the supply chain being currently produced because there's no demand for it, or some of this may be produced overseas. Have you looked into that too much or, as far as the equipment that actually is used in most of our grid, the timeline to replace some of that? Have you ever looked at that or studied it
Yeah.
before?
Just a little, and so I can't speak with too much authority on it. What I have been told is that some of those large building size transformers, the things that people are most worried about, are not built in the US. They're built
Hmm.
over in Europe. And that there are few spares, as you said, available. And so, because as you said, they don't go out. I mean, they're usually repaired if you have a problem. But so in the case where you lost a number of them, many of them, I think you would not have replacements on hand. And I have read that they can take up to a year to be built. So they're not easily built as well. Now, in the time of crisis and emergency, though, people get clever, right? And
Yeah,
they cut corners, they build things quickly. So maybe it wouldn't be that long, but it would take a while.
got it. Okay. Now I know this next question is one that you kind of answered, but they want to take this from a different approach, whether cars would still work after an EMP if they're turned off during an attack. I don't know if there's any advantage to having something turned off or if it's, damage being turned on.
It's sort of the same as we talked about before. It wouldn't matter too much probably if the vehicle's shut off or if it's being run at the time when an EMP occurred. Either way, it could be damaged. The preparations are, you sort of have two choices. If the vehicle's not operational, you can cover it with a big conductive cover. That pretty much guarantees the survivability of the vehicle because it's kind of in its own little Faraday cage and it's hard to get energy to it. But it's not very practical for most people because they're driving their cars off and on all day long, right? They don't want to put a cover over every time they stop. And so the other way you do it is you put these transient suppression devices, as many as you can get into your vehicle, to try and keep the voltages that get introduced from an EMP down as low as possible. All right, and that's always been my philosophy on vehicle protection. There are products out there that you have the big honking thing you mount next to your battery or whatever, and it's supposed to protect your car. I don't know, maybe it works, but it doesn't make sense to me because the vehicle's so distributed, right? There's so many things everywhere. There's a
Mhm.
computer in my glove box. There's computers everywhere. And so my view has always been I'd rather have 5 little things spread around my vehicle that all kind of staple the max voltage that's going to occur, because I think I have a much better chance of suppressing that energy distributed in my vehicle than I would just one product at the battery. Now, with that
Oh,
said, we
okay.
sell products at the battery too, but I just like them distributed in my cigarette lighter, in my onboard diagnostics port, and wherever I can put them. I'm going to try and put transient suppression devices, and that's my approach. That's the kind of products we sell.
Do you have any specific blogs or videos to address protecting your car?
I do. If they check out my channel, they'll see some of those. And I brought some various products here just to show off. This is like the original trap. It goes in a cigarette lighter plug. It's a really novel little product that you plug in, and I did a couple of videos on how it works. This is one that goes in the onboard diagnostics port. Again, it just presses in there. You never know it's there, but it has a transient diode in it that will protect if your voltages get too high. There's ferrites that go on your battery wires. There's the big dog, which we just recently came out called the DEFCON. And it's an amazingly powerful product. You can put it on your battery if you want to do that. So, but my message is really it's more about trying to put distributed things around the vehicle. I think you have a much better protection strategy that way.
Okay. Yeah. After this video, I'll get that link from you because I'd be interested to check that out myself. Because I've seen a lot of these products marketed that, hey, you just stick this on the battery and you're good to go. But as you
Yeah.
pointed out, distribute it. Okay.
Mhm.
So the next question, and I get asked this a lot. I did a video on a Faraday ammo can a few months ago, and I'd done a lot of research showing that it's advisable to have some type of ground wire attached to the Faraday cage and then grounded, in something like I don't know, any type of like pipe or something that's, going into the ground. Is it a good idea to ground out, your Faraday trash can or container, whatever it may be?
Yeah, that question is probably the number one question I get when I go and get talks is, do I ground my Faraday cage or not?
Hmm.
And I do a bunch of demos for people to believe it. I even have a YouTube video that answers that question. Does it matter if I ground my Faraday cage? I have a Faraday cage, I put a spectrum analyzer in it, I measure the signal, and then I ground it and I see, does the signal change? And the short answer is, for an EMP, you don't have to ground your Faraday cage. All right. Now, there are
Huh.
many other things you do want to ground Faraday cages for. Let's say if you're doing a lightning discharge or high voltage discharge, you absolutely want your Faraday room grounded. But for an EMP, which is just a radiated wave of energy coming in, a high frequency radiated wave, the energy actually strikes the Faraday cage and bounces off, and some of it gets into the metal and gets absorbed. And it doesn't matter if the cage is ground or not. Both of those two things still happen regardless, which is why Faraday bags work just fine. They're not grounded. And if you stick your stuff in there, you absolutely will be protected. So the short answer is, if you want to ground your Faraday cage, great, go for it. You won't hurt anything. But
Yeah.
if you don't want to, it doesn't really matter for EMP protection.
Okay. No, it's a great answer. Again, when I did that video, it was hard to
Mhm.
argue with people in the comments section. I just kind of let people,
Yep,
provide their own, perspective, because I'd done research and I found that there was, is advisable to do it. But again, yeah, I appreciate your, a little more clarification on that point.
sure.
So here's the last question and this is kind of interesting. Is there a detector that will warn you if there's an EMP present? And again, it's not something you can hear or see.
Sure.
So is there any way, other than all the power and all electronics going out suddenly, is there any type of device you've ever seen that warns that an EMP is occurring?
Yeah, so up until a few years ago, I'd say no, because I didn't know of one. I couldn't find one. Now, maybe the government certainly has things like that, but I'm talking about commercial, where we could go buy one at Best Buy or something, right?
Right.
So I actually invented one. I'm an electrical guy, right? So I built one. I got one here. This is called the DEFCON EMP Alert, believe it or not.
Nice.
And it plugs into the wall, and I'll have to explain how it works. But the idea is, it is constantly doing two things. It's monitoring the environment, the air around you, and it's looking for an electromagnetic disturbance. And it's also monitoring the power line that it's plugged into. Okay, so it's doing
Hmm.
both at the same time. If it
Oh,
sees an event that looks like an E1, E2, that really sharp zap of energy, it will sound an alarm and say, hey, we just had a big electromagnetic disturbance. Now,
huh.
E3 hasn't started yet. So the voltage on the power lines hasn't started coming up and started frying everything yet. But the big burst of energy did happen. And it's hardened inside, so it should survive the EMP itself. And it should give you some warning of there was been a big electromagnetic event. And we've had people occasionally get them and write and say, hey, I just had a crack of lightning like right next door and it went off. It actually detected it. And they weren't mad that it went off because they knew why it happened, but it
Yeah.
confirmed to them, yeah, it is monitoring this environment. It's giving me some indication. So
Huh.
this is the only device I know in the world, as far as I know, that's a low cost EMP type detector. It will also detect an over voltage. So if a CME starts to occur, CME might cause the voltages to rise. It will also tell you, hey, voltages on your power lines are getting way too high. You need to go open your breaker. And it'll give you a
Yeah.
continuous alarm. You go open the breaker. So that's the product that we have right now. We are working on some other products, including one that's a keychain device, which would be really slick. That would just, you'd keep it on your keychain, and if an EMP occurred, it would give you a warning no matter where you're at, which I think would be kind of
Nice.
neat. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, I know we covered roughly 20 to 21 questions. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you often get asked?
Oh boy, tons and tons of stuff. But we hit the big ones, which are the difference of EMP and CME. We talked about that, and I know it's confusing. You might have to watch that portion of the video a couple of times, but it's important to know that. What works and what doesn't work. I'm a big fan of transient suppression devices distributed around, and that goes for the home as well. If you're going to protect your home, start at the breaker panel, put you
Hmm.
on a good surge protection device, right? Put you on some of those high saturation ferrites on the power wires, and then come into the home and start saying, okay, well, I could put a surge strip here and I can plug into that, and I can use ferrites on the power cords. And these things aren't being used, but they're really important. I'm going to put those in Faraday bags, right? Sort of these layered,
Yeah.
multiple protections. That's always my message to people. The other thing I would say is that EMP protection is trying to prepare for one of these high impact, low frequency events, right? The HILF events, people call them, meaning they don't happen very often. We don't see EMPs happen very often. But if we have one, it's going to be a really big deal, right? So it takes a lot of preparations, not just to protect your electronics, but to think about much broader things like, are we going to be able to get food? Where's our water going to be
Hmm.
coming from? What are we going to do without emergency services? All of those sort of core things help guarantee your survival. So those are the things when you work up an EMP preparedness plan. Don't just think it's about electronics. Start thinking about all your basic fundamental needs.
Right.
I wrote a handbook on practical disaster preparedness, and there's a whole chapter on that, these big high impact events, and sort of how you build a preparedness plan. And I encourage people to think in that along those lines.
Awesome. Well, again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to go through all these questions. And I'll post again a link to your YouTube channel, the websites, the coupon codes for the books. And again, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. What I'd love to do is open it up in the future, to bring you back. I know a lot of times in the comments after these videos, people post a lot of questions. So we'll continue to monitor. And if you do have questions, feel free to post those below. And again, maybe we'll have a second video in the future to try to address anything we didn't. So again, thank you for taking the time to do this. And yeah, is there anything else you want to say before we end this?
No, just that, yeah, have them post some questions, and the harder the better. I love hard questions. I love people who don't believe and they want to ask difficult questions. That's fine. I'm always happy to come on and try and answer them. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Well, again, go check out his website, his YouTube channel, the EMP Doctor. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Bradley. Appreciate it. All right. As always, stay safe out there.